A reading from Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" The man said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." God said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" The man said, The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate." Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent tricked me, and I ate." The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your heel, and you will strike his heel." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We used to drive out to Minnesota every summer to visit my mom's side of the family. Through a lot of Wisconsin and into the eastern part of Minnesota, we'd drive past cornfields and soybean fields, little pockets of trees here and there. I loved watching the cornfields go by. The rhythm of the regular rows was hypnotic, and I thought the leaves waving in the wind were beautiful. The whole area used to be a forest. And of course, legend has it that Paul Bunyan cleared it with his blue ox, Babe, so that settlers could farm. When white colonizers first arrived in the Americas, they found forests abundant with fruit and nuts, good for foraging and hunting. They thought they had arrived in some miraculous promised land of plenty. What they didn't realize was that several Native American tribes practiced agroforestry along the whole eastern coast of North America, that it was the hard work of generations of indigenous Americans that had worked the miracle of abundant American forests. Indigenous Americans transplanted and cultivated trees, bearing chestnuts, persimmons, and elderberries within the forests, creating intentional fruit and nut-bearing groves so that they could harvest rather than rely on foraging by chance. And they cultivated plants that would attract animals to round out their omnivorous diet. Europeans were awed by the state of this abundant land, which of course benefited them. But rather than living into this new way of life and learning how to care for it in this new and different way, they cut down many of these rich forests, drove the people off their land, and planted the single crop fields and orchards they were accustomed to in their old country. Rather than planting corn with nitrogen-rich beans and weed-suppressing squash, a method called the Three Sisters, employed by indigenous Americans for generations, they planted fields of corn that stripped the soil of its nitrogen and required weeding, fertilization, and rotation. Now, I will admit that I only know this because I saw a meme about it, and then I did some further research, also on the internet, and we know the internet is always right, of course. But at least some of that research comes from the page of the National Farmers Union. So I figure this city/suburban girl is getting a little education. I also fully realize that this may be an idealized portrayal of indigenous Americans' relationship with their land, and that different tribes had different ways of doing things. But I've been thinking about this concept a lot. Why do we always seem to have to do the hard thing, especially when the easy thing might actually be better? What are we out to prove? Why do we rejoice, for instance, in growing tricky ornamental plants that don't belong here, that require pesticides and fertilizers to survive, as if our victory in growing them somehow proves we have bested nature? I remember a fad about 20 years ago where people were literally trying to grow palm trees in Michigan. Trees that were incredibly unhappy and had to be dug up every winter. Why do we grow food in a way that requires a whole system of artificial fertilizers and pesticides when there might be a better, different way? You may be surprised or not surprised to know that the number one crop in the U.S. is actually grass. Why do we feel it's necessary to have chemical green manicured lawns with not one spot of colorful interest. Our lush lawns are food deserts to insects and birds, and when we weed fastidiously, we deprive animals of the food and the habitats they need to survive. Many housing associations even forbid growing vegetables in your front yard. Why? Presumably because towering plants bearing ripe heirloom tomatoes and peppers would put the neighbor's boring grass to shame. Today's story in Genesis has often been misused as a way to shame women, as an origin story that explains why women can't be trusted. You may think of it this way. I actually had someone tell me once that women shouldn't be pastors because of Eve and because of their womanly wiles. Yes, those were the actual words. As if Eve tricked Adam. But if you go back just a couple of verses in the chapter, it's there quite clearly. Adam was right there with Eve when the serpent offered the fruit of the tree of knowledge to both of them. It seems that according to this story, original sin is not Eve's fault for disobeying God and tricking Adam. It is rather rooted in the desire for godlike power and control over nature that they both wanted, of wanting to have that power rather than the perfect world that God would have given us, and culminates in the first ever game of, I swear it wasn't me. Instead of taking responsibility, Adam throws Eve under the bus, and then Eve does the same to the serpent. God, angry at all of their ridiculousness, then orders them all into an epic timeout. I would argue that rather than an origin story about the wiles of women, this story tells us about our original sin. Our desire for godlike power and control, and also for our unwillingness to accept the responsibility that necessarily comes with that power. It's like God said, don't touch the hot stove. And then Eve tried it, and so did Adam, just because the serpent told them that they couldn't know whether God was telling the truth unless they did the thing. So instead of living in harmony with the world that God had created, they set off on a course that put them at odds with it, always needing to prove their mastery of it. It's an ethos that has led to deforestation, habitat loss, soil degradation, pollution, and climate change. We keep doing it because we expect that somehow we will find a way to save ourselves from the impacts of our war with God's good gift of creation. Except that in the end, nature always wins. We think we are in charge, but the truth is that we never have been. But just as God walked to meet them in the garden in the time of the evening breeze, God continued to stay with them, just as God continues to stay with us. Remember, God went out of the garden too. Although our ancestors forgot that they could have lived in harmony with nature and instead set about subduing it, the God who created Adam and Eve in God's own image continued to walk with them through times of joy and times of sorrow. One of the most difficult things we can do is realize that our power only reaches so far. There are so many things we can't fix. And yet, if we look around us, we might stop and see that there are opportunities in this place, in this time, that wouldn't be here if it weren't for God's grace and love for us. That if we stop struggling so hard for just a moment, we might take the opportunity to notice that the God who loves us has always been with us every step of the way, accompanying us in a wondrous gift of grace. Amen.